All right. 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to week 6 of Early Christian History. Our video today, again, is going to be 3 lessons, 2 of them having to do with the Roman Empire, and the third will actually leave the Roman Empire for a little while. Again, the history of the Roman Empire, such as it is really the direct antecedent for Western civilization today that we are a part of here in the United States. And so we focus much more on that, but it is instructive to go beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire and Western civilization to see what was going on in other parts of the world. Because again, today the world is a whole lot smaller, communicated-wise, than it was then. You had very different cultures that developed independently of one another in ancient times because there was very limited swapping of information and ideas between them. But now it's a little bit different. But it is instructive to go back and look. We'll start with the Roman Empire. And we will begin today right around the year AD 286 with Emperor Diocletian. Now, here's what he looked like, allegedly. If the name sounds a little bit familiar to you, we did mention him in our Week 3 lesson as being one of the emperors who oversaw one of the 10 waves of Christian persecution in the Roman Empire. As a matter of fact, his was the last one, the 10th. Also worth noting that his might have been the worst. We'll get to that in just a second. But again, Diocletian was the last of the Roman emperors to directly persecute Christians. Now, a little history lesson. When we mentioned Marcus Aurelius as one of the great post-Christ Caesars of Rome, Roman emperor, it was 100 years later before Diocletian came to power. In those 100 years, there were 28 different Roman emperors. 24 of them were assassinated. It's not good to be the king, or good to be emperor in this case. As you can rightly figure out, that caused a lot of instability, a lot of uncertainty, and it really, really weakened the empire. Well, Diocletian came to power in a very interesting way. His story is quite fascinating, insofar as he was not only not born into any royal family, the emperor was not considered a royal lineage, but he was born a pauper, a poor guy. He joined the army and quickly found out he was an incredible soldier. And as he was promoted into management in the Roman legions, he found out he had a gift for military management. And that really vaulted him up into being a general before he was the age of 30. In the year 284, the armies of Rome voted Diocletian as the new emperor. Now, of course, he takes the crown with the understanding that 90% of his immediate predecessors had been killed. He did not want to have that happen to him, so he figured he was going to have to make some drastic type changes. Well, what he did was he looked at the Roman Empire just from a pure geography standpoint and management and decided it was simply too big for one person to have this kind of power. So he literally split the Roman Empire into 2 and then split it into smaller pieces. The up-down split of the Roman Empire produced the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. He placed one of his fellow military commanders, Maximian, as the ruler of the western part of the empire. The eastern part of the empire, while he would be the western part, what is now mostly Europe and northern Africa. And he subdivided them into even smaller parts. He took those 2 big parts, divided them again into 4 parts, and had Caesars, the title he gave, to the overall commanders in those 4. Then he took all of that and divided it up into 120 provinces. Some were called prefectures. Prefectures were ruled by a prefect. Some were called a diocese. Those were ruled by vicars. Some were called provinces. Those were ruled by governors. Now, you'll recall Pontius Pilate, during the time of Jesus, was the Roman governor of the area, Judea. And so the system of local governors was not completely foreign to Rome, but under Diocletian, he gave them very, very strong independent authority. Sounds a little bit like what we are supposed to have here in the U.S., right? With 50 states and one nation. All 50 governors have vast powers within their own state and zero power beyond their state. So, from an administrative standpoint, Diocletian's idea to sort of split the empire up and to delegate authority worked very well. It was a good model that was more or less accepted by everyone. Unfortunately, Diocletian wanted to do more with the government. He saw government as taking a very active role in the economy of the world. He thought, quite simplistically, that boy, if the poor people had money, we'd be okay. So let's print up a bunch of money, or in this case, coin a lot of money, and dish it out to a lot of people. Well, that sounds good in a fairy tale, but in the real world it produces what's called inflation. That is to say, the 5 gold pieces you have now can buy what 3 gold pieces bought a month ago. The price of everything goes up, and so the value of your money goes down. Ironically, we're experiencing a bit of inflation right now as I record this here in the United States. This led to an economic depression. Economic depression led to unhappiness, riots, strife, crime. The number one predictor of crime is poverty. If you can get a handle on poverty, you will almost certainly have a handle on crime. That has always been true. And so, again, the Roman Empire suffered quite a bit. Crime became much more rampant. The misery index, such as it was, shot up under Diocletian. While all this was going on, Diocletian was very, 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 very anti-Christian. Now, at this point in history, not quite half of the Roman Empire had either converted to Christianity or was at the very least sympathetic with Christians. Diocletian was not. He did not like Christians at all. Again, much like other Caesars before him, or emperors, Christians were a very convenient boogeyman for anything that went wrong. Economy's crashing? Blame the Christians. Someone stubbed their toe? Blame the Christians. That sort of thing. He insisted on being called Dominus Noster, our Lord, in Latin. Well, you can figure out that went over about like a lead balloon with Christians who already have a Lord to worship. Thank you very much. Diocletian was very, very brutal about creating lots of Christian martyrs. The most famous of the martyrs of the Christian church under Diocletian's rule is George. He was tortured and put to death on April 23rd in the year 303. This date's ever since been remembered as the feast day of St. George. Now, you probably have heard of the legend of St. George involving him slaying a dragon. It was a popular Christmas or children's tale, St. George and the Dragon. I have no freaking idea how a dragon got drug into all this. No one in history does either, but it's just another way of recognizing and appreciating and understanding that history can be changed and not always accurately. Sometimes the legend is far more interesting than the facts, and the legend will unfortunately live on. Diocletian was very purposeful about destroying any copies of Scripture he found, had many famous bonfires in Rome to torch Christian literature and scriptures. Of course, that had the effect of making the Christians even stronger. There was an entire village of Phrygia, 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 in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, that was destroyed by Roman legions simply because they would not obey Diocletian under any circumstances. Matter of fact, the sort of the gallows humor of the time insisted that the lions in the Colosseum wouldn't eat Christians anymore because they were already full. Evidently, lots of martyrs became martyrs under Diocletian's rule. As for Diocletian, yeah, he managed to last 21 years. He actually retired. He was not assassinated. And lived several years after his retirement as emperor. But again, splitting the Roman Empire, good idea. Bad idea, inserting the Roman government into the economy to a direct degree. Always be careful about this. I'm going to get into a little econ here real quick. Be very, very careful about government inserting themselves into the economy because they pay no price for being wrong. If you're a businessman and you make terrible business decisions, you pay a price for being wrong. If you're in the government, make poor economic decisions, you're still going to get a paycheck. Never trust anyone who pays no price for being wrong. All right, let's see if that... All right, the next lesson has to do with the next emperor of Rome, Constantine. Constantine the First, or Constantine the Great, depending upon who you ask. He officially ended the persecution of Christians. As a young man, much like Diocletian, Constantine was a soldier. He had a father who was one of the Caesars in the Western Roman Empire under Diocletian. Constantine took his father's place upon his death. Constantine was very ambitious. Unlike Diocletian, he thought the Roman Empire was just fine under one ruler, and he wanted that ruler to be him. So in his attempt to be emperor of at least the western half of the empire, he set out to conquer a rival. At the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, Constantine was victorious. The other commander actually drowned. Now, it's what happened during that battle that was significant for all of history. Constantine claimed that he saw a cross in the sky with the Latin words "in hoc signo vientes," meaning, "in this sign you shall conquer." He took that, obviously, as a sign. Later, he said that he had a vision of Christ in a dream with the Greek letters chi and rho circling around him. Chi and rho are the first two letters in the Greek spelling of Christ. From that point on, Constantine viewed Christians and Christianity with great respect. He actually used the cross and the Greek letters chi and rho on his battle symbol, his standard. Constantine did something, again, 1 year later, that was incredible. The Edict of Milan, which basically ended persecution for all Christians in the Roman Empire. Quote, "Our purpose is to grant both to the Christians and to all others full authority to follow whatever worship each man was desired." Can you imagine how this must have felt to the Christians after 3 centuries of near constant persecution? I can only imagine the tears of joy that fell, the celebrations that took place. Finally, we can worship our Lord and not suffer for it. It would be an end, for all practical purposes, to the addition of the Christian martyrs. But it wasn't universally received with praise, even among Christians. There was a segment of the Christian community who felt like if they were not being oppressed, then they weren't suffering adequately to worship God. This made it too easy. Anybody could worship God when there's no consequences for worshiping God. There's no hardship. A lot of them went off to form monasteries, the first monasteries. Females formed convents to worship God away from the world. But yeah, there was a segment of the Christian population that didn't know how to behave if they weren't being persecuted. Very odd, but there is something to be said for that. The old saying goes, "The more you suffer, the more you care." Well, that's been used for very bad purposes, but there is almost something noble about suffering for your faith. And there were some Christians that were not 100% comfortable with this. But in any sober recollection of this and reflection on this, this is a good thing. Not just for Christianity, but for anyone worshiping their God. The fact that you don't have to worry about being persecuted for doing something that is intensely personal is a good thing. So we'll treat it as such. Now, the question that has dogged historians for years was Constantine himself a Christian during all this time? A whole lot of historians in the past have said yes, because they sometimes referred to the Battle of Milvian Bridge as the conversion of Constantine. Well, really, there's no evidence that converted him to Christianity. Certainly, it made him much more sympathetic, even respectful of Christianity, thus the end of the persecution. It appears that Constantine was baptized late in his life and may have converted then, But other than that, there's no evidence of a profession of faith from Constantine. His mother had a very public one, but not him. So, yeah, that's kind of odd. You would think somebody that did that much good for Christians would be a Christian themselves, but that was not necessarily the case. Constantine, like we said, was a very, very ambitious emperor. Again, he wanted to rule the whole empire. He defeated the emperor of the eastern part of the empire in 324 and made a major decision. He moved the capital from Rome to the ancient city of Byzantine. Byzantine is modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. Great location for a capital with an empire of this size, because it was more or less in the center. Also, it was almost literally the bridge between the East and the West in those days. Right there at the entrance to the Black Sea, a lot of Eastern and Western traders met halfway there, and thus, as a result, the city, which came to be known as Constantinople, Constantine City, became a great center of trade and wealth and cultural development, artistic development. The other big event in Constantine's career was getting together the Council of Nicaea. Basically, 300 bishops he invited in to the city there to discuss religious matters and to settle questions. We've mentioned this in some of our other classes before. At this time, as Christianity was becoming more popular, there were other religions trying to latch onto that popularity with their own little spin of Christianity, and it was not Christian. The Gnostics were the most conspicuous insofar as they said Jesus was a great guy, but he was not the Son of God because he was in flesh, and all flesh is evil. Therefore, what you saw was an apparition or whatever. Well, believing that Christ died for our sins and was resurrected after 3 days is pretty much the central tenet of Christianity. We mentioned in the Apostles' Creed that it very specifically said, in the Apostles' Creed, Christ died, went to hell, was resurrected on the third day. And if you deny that, then it is not Christian. So they had to, in addition to the Apostles' Creed, really drive home the point that this is the true church, Catholic, true, real. And they adopted, while at the Council of Nicaea, the Nicene Creed, N-I-C-E-N-E Creed, which came about after 2 months of talks. Basically, it said that Jesus is God. He was more than just a good man, a moral teacher, a martyr. He was God in the flesh, God made flesh, God among us, Emmanuel. He was fully human and fully divine. Still, to this day, a hard concept, but that's what Christians believe. And the Nicene Creed is still the central creedal position of all Christianity. He also, the second important topic discussed there was, how do we mark the resurrection of Christ? Again, that resurrection, the fact that Christ died, went to hell, and was reborn after 3 days, is, again, the central point of Christianity. So we got to celebrate this resurrection, right? We got to mark this, not just any other day. When to do it? Well, some of the Christians wanted to do it in conjunction with the Jewish Passover celebration. Of course, Passover was the time, that's why the Jews were in Jerusalem on the week that Christ was killed. Others wanted to break away from the Jewish connection and kind of set it up themselves. Constantine himself made the offer, so he wasn't just hosting this thing. He was really involved in Christian decisions here. He decided to choose what we now know as Easter, the Sunday after the first full moon of the spring equinox. Again, much like with Valentine's Day replacing a pagan holiday, this was designed to glom on to the pagan marking of the spring equinox and to replace it with a Christian tradition. Again, much like with Valentine's Day, even with Christmas, the when that we celebrate it is not nearly as important as the fact that we commemorate it. Constantine, from a Christian standpoint, did a lot of good. He allowed Christians, obviously, to worship freely. He brought Rome back together as a single political empire. He settled disputes in the church. The problem, though, began when he continued this path and the government and religion became intertwined. You're asking for problems then. Again, by this time, about half the Roman population was Christian, or at least sympathetic. The biggest thing Constantine did in this respect was to revamp the entire Roman court system, which was seen as pagan in tradition and unfair to Christians. He made the courts run by Christians. The local priest or the vicar, viceroy, whatever, was the judge also. The church leaders wore long robes like the old judges of the Roman Republic did, and so the tradition of robes, priests wearing robes in church continues to this day. It led to the idea, and it's a very poisonous idea, that the emperor can use the courts to mandate what people believe, what they worship, how they worship, whom they worship, when they worship. So you're replacing one oppressor with another here, aren't you? The same Christians that were persecuted under anti-Christian rule for 3 centuries, they were now in a position to do the same to others. It's very, very hard. Christianity is not meant to be forced on people like that. If Christianity is not voluntary, it's not Christianity. And as we will see as we continue through our study of the early church history, there were many in the church Christianity, alleged Christians, who very much took advantage of this. Okay, for our last lesson today, we're going to go a couple thousand miles to the east and look at the nation of India and what was going on while Constantine was beginning to ease up on the Christians and all that. As that was going on in the Roman Empire, in India, they were having what is now called the Golden Age of India, sometimes referred to as the Gupta dynasty, Gupta. They were the ruling forces in India at the time. They moved the capital, expanded the empire to the north, accumulated a great amount of wealth, but more than just that, they were interested in cultural development. The one king that ruled for 50 years was, and forgive me for butchering the pronunciation of these names, but in India they just sometimes add words together to make one long, big word. Samudragupta. Samudragupta of the Gupta family, was the king for 50 years, and evidently he was a great poet and musician in his own right. So, as the king of India, he was very, very conspicuous about supporting not just the economy, but the arts. So as a result, arts, science, architects flourished in India during this period. Again, roughly 320 to 500 AD, not quite 2 centuries there. The astronomers of India, using, of course, primitive tools at the time, explained what an eclipse was, the revolution of the Earth. They correctly guessed or determined the diameter of the moon. They developed a 12-month calendar. They were way ahead of the curve. They were also ahead of the curve in a lot of very practical things, iron making. You can go to New Delhi, India today and see an iron pillar that was erected 1900 years ago. That's remarkable, but the most remarkable thing about this bad boy is that there is not a bit of rust on it. Scholars are still trying to figure out exactly how they accomplished that. So, yes, chemistry, the sciences, very, very advanced in India. They were the first to use what we now call Arabic numerals. In math, they invented really the concept of zero. Now that sounds like a very minor thing, but for the basis of math, the existence of zero value is crucial. The Indians of this era were the first to use it. They were artistic in the use and manufacture and design of cloth for clothes. They were the first to use cotton for this purposes. Calico was also a very popular fabric used in India at this time. Again, this is a culturally flourishing area, and even though it doesn't have a direct impact or precedent over the U.S. and modern Western civilization, it's fascinating to look at nations like this who were, man, in so many ways so far ahead of the curve, who managed to avoid some of the pratfalls of Western civilization. By all accounts, the people of India during the Golden Age were very prosperous, but very generous as well. Every 5 years, a great festival was held to benefit the needy. They would come to major cities and literally dump their gold, silver, precious jewels, anything of value into a big pile in the middle of the main street. They would have 3 days of festivals and shows and everything, and then they would start handing the stuff out to the needy people, and there was so much stuff it took months sometimes to hand it out. The king, very conspicuously in an act of charity, would go up to the pile, take off his robe, which was just super nice, his crown, coins in his pocket, and put it there as a show of charity. Literature, as you would expect, also was very, very much flourishing in India at this time. Their two foundational scripts, much like we go back to Greece and the Iliad and the Odyssey, their two foundational scripts, and I'm going to butcher these names, I will not require you to spell them, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Two very long books. The Mahabharata is 1.8 million words long. Try memorizing that bad boy. But much like the Iliad and the Odyssey was about epic poetry, love, war, very grand things, so too was the Mahabharata, but it was mainly about love. It was about charity. It was about not only man and wife love, but agape love, love for fellow man, brotherly love. Very positive art produced by India at this time. The main religion in India was and is Hinduism. It's one of the world's oldest religions. It predates Judaism and Christianity. It's not based on a belief in a personal God. It believes that there are gods for everything, so God is always around. They don't believe in salvation from sin like Christians do. They believe that we're given chance after chance to live life perfectly. Thus the idea of reincarnation. Thus the reason why many people even today in India will not eat the flesh of another animal or even use leather or something, because they believe in another life they can come back as a cow or a sheep or whatever. Very interesting civilization here. One of their down points, a couple of down points, they did not have good, strong infrastructure, roads, so trade was hampered necessarily. They did not have a strong military. And unfortunately, at this point in history, might makes right. And if you don't have a strong military, it's only a matter of time. And of course, after the Golden Age was ended by infighting and then Mongols coming in from out of India and whatnot. But for about a 200-year period, you could make the very strong case that the most advanced nation in the world was India during the Golden Age. Think about it, talk about it, dream about it. We'll see you on Monday.